On the day a millionaire was to marry his stunning secretary, a mysterious envelope arrived from his ex-wife. What it contained wasn't a plea or a threat. It was a quiet revelation that dismantled his empire from the inside. He thought he replaced her. He never imagined she held the keys to everything. The echo of jazz played low from the surround speakers, blending with the gentle clatter of ice cubes swirling in a glass of bourbon. Alexander Hartley leaned back into the Italian leather chair in his study, one leg crossed, fingers rhythmically tapping against the armrest as he stared out through the wide windows that overlooked the harbor. The water outside glistened under the fading orange light of late afternoon, yachts gently rocking in place, a perfect backdrop to the image he had crafted over the years. Wealth, certainty, elegance, control. He wasn't thinking about business tonight. The merger had gone through. The deal with the European investors was signed and sealed, and every financial outlet had his name on their front page. His empire was not just thriving, it was dominating. But Alexander wasn't celebrating numbers this evening. He was preparing for something far more personal, something that felt less like an ending and more like a rebranding. The door creaked slightly as someone stepped in. Olivia Reynolds, his executive assistant, or, as many within his inner circle already suspected, something more than that, entered the study with the subtle grace of a woman who knew her way around power. Her blazer was off, her silk blouse slightly undone, but nothing about her demeanor was casual. Everything Olivia did was intentional, from the way she carried herself to the careful pauses in her speech that made people lean in closer. "Mr. Hartley," she said smoothly, placing a file on the table. "The courier just dropped these off. Final documents from the divorce attorney. Your signature's the only thing missing now." He took the folder, eyes briefly scanning the heading before flipping it open. "About time," he muttered, picking up his pen. Olivia didn't respond. She stood by the edge of the desk, watching him, not his hand or the paper, but his face. He didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. Not a single flicker of emotion interrupted the steady strokes of ink sealing the fate of a 17-year marriage. "That's it," he said, closing the folder. "Officially done." Olivia gave a slight nod, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then, in a voice more personal than professional, she asked, "How do you feel?" Alexander turned toward her and offered a half-smile, lifting his glass. "Lighter." The room fell silent again, except for the hum of the jazz in the background. Alexander looked around, taking in the polished decor, the curated art pieces on the walls, the shelves lined with first-edition books he never read, but displayed for the sake of aesthetics. Everything had been designed to look effortless, and everything was his vision, his taste, his rules. Except it hadn't always been. For years, that vision had been shared. Eleanor Hartley, now just a name in a document, had once walked through these halls with plans in her head and dreams in her eyes. She had chosen the furniture, selected the artwork, insisted on building the rooftop garden that he now claimed as his personal retreat. She was never loud about her contributions. She didn't need to be. Her presence was felt in the quiet details, the warmth in the spaces, the subtle harmony in the design. But over time, harmony had given way to silence, and silence to indifference. Alexander stood and moved toward the window. His reflection caught in the glass, overlapping the city lights with the man he had become, sharp-suited, cold-eyed, every bit the figure people envied and feared. He sipped his bourbon again. "She didn't even fight it," he said, more to himself than to Olivia. "Didn't try to contest anything. Just signed and disappeared." Olivia tilted her head. Maybe she was just done too. He chuckled under his breath. Eleanor was never the type to walk away without leaving a mark. Olivia raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Instead, she stepped closer and placed a hand lightly on his arm. "The past is behind you now. What matters is what's ahead." Alexander looked at her hand, then at her eyes. The curve of her lips hinted at something that had yet to be spoken aloud, something that had lingered between them for months, if not longer. He didn't pull away. "You're right," he said softly. "It's time to move forward." Across the city, in a modest two-bedroom rental nestled between rows of aging brick buildings, Eleanor Hartley sat at a kitchen table cluttered with old letters, loose receipts, and a cracked coffee mug that had seen better days. Her hair, still damp from the shower, clung to her face, and a gray cardigan hung loosely over her shoulders. She stared at the envelope in front of her, thick, beige, and ominous. The final divorce packet had arrived hours earlier, but she hadn't opened it yet. She didn't need to. She already knew what it contained. She'd read every line months ago, when the first draft arrived. There were no surprises anymore, not on paper at least. The real surprises had already passed. The way Alexander's voice had grown distant, how his eyes had stopped lingering on her, how he stopped coming home without offering any explanations. The last few years had been a slow erasure, not an abrupt ending. Still, there was something about the sealed envelope that unsettled her. It wasn't grief or anger. It was a strange emptiness. Like finishing a book you didn't realize you were already halfway through. She finally opened it, scanned through the pages, then signed her name. Her handwriting had changed, she noticed. Tighter, sharper, less curved. She wondered if that meant anything. The apartment was quiet except for the rhythmic dripping of the leaky faucet. On the couch, her 17-year-old son, Ryan, was asleep, curled up with his backpack still half-zipped beside him. She got up, walked over, and gently pulled a blanket over him. His face, so much like Alexander's, looked peaceful in sleep. Innocent, unaware of everything unraveling around them. Eleanor walked back to the kitchen and sat again. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from her friend Lauren. "How are you holding up?" She stared at the screen for a moment before replying. "I'm fine. Just tired." It was a lie, but it was easier than trying to explain what tired really meant. Not just physically, but in her bones, in her spirit. Tired of pretending, of surviving, of being dignified while watching the life she built be traded for someone younger, shinier, newer. She reached for a small wooden box in the cupboard. Inside, tucked beneath old photos and a few dried rose petals, was a letter she had written long ago but never sent. She unfolded it slowly, rereading each line as if someone else had written it. And then, something shifted in her expression, subtle but distinct. A thought, a seed, something not yet fully formed, but alive. She folded the letter again and stared out the small window above the sink. The city lights flickered far beyond the rooftops. Somewhere out there, Alexander was probably sipping aged whiskey and feeling triumphant. But Eleanor didn't feel defeated. Not anymore. A quiet resolve was beginning to bloom beneath the ache. And before the night ended, she opened her laptop and began typing something. A name, a message, a beginning. Whatever came next, she would not be a footnote in Alexander Hartley's story. She would write her own. What would you have done in Alexander's place after receiving that letter? Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell us. Was it justice or just karma? Rate this story from 0 to 10. Hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will keep you hooked until the last second. The days that followed the official divorce moved slowly, like molasses dripping through time. Eleanor Hartley found herself waking up before dawn, not from habit or necessity, but from the sheer weight of her thoughts. Her mind wouldn't rest, even when her body pleaded for sleep. The apartment was always cold in the morning, the old radiator groaning in protest as it struggled to warm the rooms. She often sat at the edge of her bed wrapped in a thick robe, staring at the wall in silence before finally rising. She didn't know what she was waiting for, a sign, a feeling, a new beginning. But all she had was quiet and an endless stretch of uncertainty. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee from the night before. She reheated a cup in the microwave, though it tasted bitter and stale, as if even the flavor had given up. She stood by the narrow window, holding the chipped mug in her hands, and looked out over the city. The streets were waking up, delivery trucks groaning, early commuters rushing, neon signs flickering to life. Everything moved forward. But Eleanor stood still, caught in the space between what had been and whatever came next. On the surface, she was composed. Neighbors in the building greeted her with polite smiles. The woman at the corner grocery asked about her son. Her sister called daily, offering sympathy wrapped in cheerful advice. "You just need a fresh start," she'd say, as if fresh starts were as simple as flipping a switch. Eleanor nodded, thanked her, and hung up. But deep inside, she felt like she was unraveling slowly, thread by thread. The papers from the lawyer lay untouched on the coffee table, though she had already signed everything. She couldn't bring herself to move them. They felt like a wound left open on purpose. Every time she passed by, her eyes flicked toward the manila envelope, as if expecting it to whisper something she had missed. But it never did. It just sat there, indifferent and final. Ryan, her son, moved around the apartment with the kind of restless energy only teenagers possess. He avoided eye contact lately, keeping his headphones on most of the time, locking himself in his room for hours. Eleanor didn't push. She knew he was trying to make sense of things in his own way. Every so often, he'd ask a question that made her heart ache. Do you think Dad's happier now? Or was it me? Did I do something wrong? She always answered softly, firmly, No, sweetheart. None of this is your fault. But she wondered if he believed her. Alexander, meanwhile, had wasted no time embracing his new reality. Photos had already surfaced online, social event snapshots, taken with just the right angle and lighting to show him smiling, drink in hand, Olivia close beside him, her arm casually resting on his. The headlines were subtle but pointed. Power couple reimagined. Hartley seen with stunning associate at gala. Eleanor didn't go looking for them, but they found her anyway, in suggested articles, forwarded messages, the way gossip finds its target like a heat-seeking missile. She didn't rage. She didn't cry. She felt something colder, a dull, muted sense of betrayal that didn't even sting anymore. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it was no longer surprising. It was just confirmation of what she already knew. She'd been erased from his story, edited out like a forgotten chapter in a book he didn't want to reread. But she hadn't forgotten. She remembered everything. Not just the late nights when she reviewed his presentations, fixing the phrasing he'd later take credit for. Not just the long meetings where she sat quietly in the background, nodding supportively while he dominated the room. She remembered the sacrifices, the career she left behind, the time she spent building his image, the quiet compromises that added up over years until she barely recognized herself. She remembered how Olivia first joined the company, an intern with too much perfume and too little experience, and how Alexander had defended her from day one. She's got potential, he'd said. Now Eleanor understood what kind of potential he'd really seen. One night, unable to sleep, she opened a drawer and pulled out a weathered notebook she hadn't touched in years. It was filled with old sketches, business ideas, handwritten notes. She flipped through the pages slowly, absorbing the forgotten parts of herself. There were plans she'd once dreamed of, concepts for a boutique consultancy, ideas for a publication that never materialized. She stared at the pages like they belonged to someone else, someone she used to be, someone she had buried under years of compromise. The notebook trembled slightly in her hands, and she realized for the first time in weeks that her heart was racing, not from sadness, but from something she couldn't name yet. A spark, a question. What if I still could? She closed the notebook and set it on the table, then stood up and walked to the living room. She stared at the divorce papers for a long time, then moved them aside and placed the notebook in the center. Something shifted in her expression. Not defiance, not yet, but purpose. A seed of resolve she hadn't felt in years. The next morning, she called her former mentor, a woman named Celia who had once offered her a business partnership Eleanor turned down to support Alexander's ambitions. The phone rang twice before Celia answered, her voice just as warm and direct as Eleanor remembered. Eleanor, Celia said, surprised. It's been a while. I know, Eleanor replied quietly. But I was wondering, do you still have that space downtown? The one you were thinking of turning into a co-working studio? Celia hesitated for a second. I do. It's just sitting there, honestly. What? I have an idea, Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength. And I think I'm ready to do something about it. Celia was silent for a moment, then laughed gently. I always said you had more in you than you let people see. Come by tomorrow. Let's talk. After the call ended, Eleanor sat still for several minutes, letting the moment settle around her like dust in a sunbeam. She wasn't sure what this meant yet. She wasn't even sure what she wanted to build. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't waiting for something to happen to her. She was reaching towards something, unclear, undefined, but hers. That afternoon, she received a package from the law firm, an official copy of the finalized divorce decree, sealed and notarized. She opened the envelope, glanced at the signature page, then placed it in a folder and tucked it away in a cabinet. It wasn't something she wanted to look at again. It wasn't her story anymore. Later that evening, after dinner, Ryan sat beside her on the couch, eyes glued to his phone. Mom, he said suddenly, are we going to be okay? Eleanor looked at him for a long time before answering. We already are. He didn't say anything else, but he nodded, just slightly, and leaned his head against her shoulder. She kissed the top of his head and wrapped her arm around him. And for the first time since the papers had arrived, Eleanor believed the words she'd spoken. Up in the penthouse, Alexander was pouring a glass of wine, Olivia seated across from him with her legs curled beneath her. They spoke in low voices about the upcoming gala, which sponsors to prioritize, which journalists to invite. He seemed relaxed, at ease in this new chapter, but he hadn't noticed the small cracks forming in places he thought were solid. He hadn't seen the way Olivia's eyes lingered on his private notes, the way she subtly redirected his meetings. He didn't know yet that some of the people he called loyal had been quietly distancing themselves, unsure of this new dynamic, wary of the abrupt shift in his personal life. He was too busy enjoying the illusion of progress to see the foundation shifting beneath his feet. And somewhere, tucked beneath Eleanor's pillow, was a letter she had written the night she left the penthouse. Not a letter to him, but a letter about him. About the truths no one else knew. About the secrets buried beneath the empire he thought was invincible. She hadn't decided yet whether she'd ever send it, but she knew she wouldn't need to. The lavish dining room of Alexander Hartley's penthouse gleamed under the golden glow of the custom chandelier, its crystal strands catching the light in a way that seemed to dance every time someone moved. The long marble table, once reserved for family dinners, now played host to sleek business brunches, exclusive tastings, and curated social gatherings. It no longer echoed with laughter from Ryan's childhood jokes or Eleanor's warm, melodic voice discussing art exhibitions or weekend getaways. Those sounds had faded into the past, and in their place was a different kind of music, corporate conversations, flirtatious toasts, and the carefully calculated laughter of guests whose loyalty came with a price tag. At the center of this reinvention stood Olivia Reynolds, no longer simply the assistant at Alexander's side, but now the woman whose presence defined his new life. She had adapted quickly to the space. Within weeks of Eleanor's departure, Olivia had quietly replaced the neutral-toned cushions with rich velvet ones, removed family photos and replaced them with contemporary abstract paintings, and altered the aroma of the penthouse with expensive candles that filled the air with notes of oud and black figure. Alexander hadn't objected. In fact, he encouraged her changes. He saw it as evolution, a refreshing contrast to what he considered the staleness of his past life. He didn't miss Eleanor, or at least, that's what he told himself. She had been a chapter, a necessary part of his ascent, but not someone meant to stay in the spotlight. She was supportive, certainly, but predictable, and predictability, in Alexander's eyes, was synonymous with irrelevance. Olivia, on the other hand, challenged him in a way that felt invigorating. She had an edge, an assertiveness wrapped in softness that made her feel exciting yet controlled. She didn't just exist in his world, she made herself essential in it. And Alexander was a man who respected necessity. Still, the shift wasn't entirely seamless. There were subtleties he hadn't accounted for. Some of his old business partners were more hesitant than he anticipated. One investor, during a private meeting, had leaned in and said, "You know, Eleanor had a way of making people feel grounded. You've lost that." Alexander had smiled politely, changed the subject, but the words lingered longer than he admitted. Another client had canceled a deal abruptly with no explanation. Alexander chalked it up to market volatility. But in truth, there was a shift happening, subtle and unspoken. Eleanor had always served as his social compass, refined, gracious, intuitive. Olivia, though competent, carried a different energy, more assertive, less diplomatic. Meanwhile, Eleanor was navigating her own transition, though with far less glamour. The downtown studio space Celia offered was dusty and unkempt, remnants of its last tenant still scattered in corners, faded posters, a broken chair, a half-used coffee machine that emitted strange sounds when plugged in. But it had windows. Big, beautiful windows that allowed natural light to pour in and reflect across the polished concrete floor. For Eleanor, it was a canvas, raw, imperfect, but full of possibility. She visited it every afternoon after finishing her freelance administrative work for a local marketing firm, something she'd picked up temporarily to pay bills. She carried boxes of materials, paints, supplies, ideas. With each visit, the space started to take form. She painted one wall a deep green, placed a bookshelf filled with design manuals and entrepreneurship books, and brought in a vintage sofa she found at a second-hand store. She wasn't sure what the space would become yet. A consultancy? A shared workspace for creatives? A boutique gallery? All she knew was that it would be hers, created not as a reaction to Alexander's world, but as a reflection of her own identity, long buried under the weight of being someone else's anchor. Ryan often joined her after school, sometimes just to do homework, sometimes to help clean or paint. He didn't say much, but his presence gave her comfort. They were rebuilding something, silently, together. There was a moment one evening, as they were arranging books on the shelf, when he asked, "Why are you doing all this, Mom?" She paused, her hands lingering on a hardcover, then answered, "Because I need to remember what I'm capable of." He didn't ask anything further. He simply nodded and continued helping. Back in the penthouse, Olivia had started stepping into roles Eleanor once held. She answered Alexander's calls and meetings, coordinated travel, negotiated vendor contracts, and began making decisions without consulting him first. At first, he admired her initiative, but eventually, he began to notice the cracks. She snapped at staff. She dismissed concerns from his executive team. One of his senior managers quit unexpectedly, citing a toxic dynamic in the office. Alexander brushed it off as weak leadership. He had always believed in pushing people to their limits, but the limits were showing elsewhere too. Olivia had requested he move some investment accounts under her name, claiming it would make managing business logistics easier. He complied without much thought. He trusted her. Or rather, he trusted the idea of her, the image he had built of their seamless partnership. Trust had become a formality, not a feeling. He had done the same with Eleanor for years, and it had never failed him. He didn't see the irony. Or maybe he chose not to. What he did notice, however, was the distance between them starting to grow even as they spent more time together. Their conversations became more about logistics than connection. Olivia no longer laughed at his jokes like she used to. He caught her texting late at night, silencing her phone when he entered the room. When he questioned her about it, she waved him off. "Clients," she said. "Just work." But Alexander, despite his arrogance, wasn't entirely blind. He started asking himself things he had never needed to ask before. Not because he doubted her, but because he feared being outmaneuvered. One morning, as he prepared for a board presentation, he reached for a folder on his desk and noticed one of the pages had been altered. The numbers didn't match his version. He called Olivia in. She didn't flinch. "I revised them last night," she said. "Your figures were outdated." He stared at her, uncertain whether to feel impressed or offended. "I wasn't aware you made those decisions now," he said calmly. She smiled, leaning against the desk. "I thought we were building this together. Or am I mistaken?" Alexander said nothing. She left the room moments later, but her words hung in the air. Across town, Eleanor sat at her desk in the studio, staring at a blueprint she had just sketched, an idea for a workshop series focused on professional reinvention for women over 40. It wasn't fully formed yet, just lines on paper. But it felt right. It felt like something she would have wanted years ago, when she first began feeling invisible. She reached for her phone and called Celia. "I want to host a launch event," she said. "Something small, just to test the idea." Celia didn't hesitate. "I'll help you coordinate. You've got something here." As Eleanor hung up, she felt a rush of adrenaline. Not fear this time. Momentum. Her hands trembled slightly, not from anxiety, but from anticipation. This wasn't about proving herself to Alexander or replacing what she lost. It was about reclaiming the parts of her she had given away so freely. That night, as Alexander scrolled through his calendar, he noticed a gap in his next week's schedule, a free evening where nothing was booked. Olivia, passing behind him, glanced at the screen and said, "We should do something then. Maybe a dinner party? Show everyone the new us." Alexander hesitated. "The new us," he repeated. She smiled, brushing her hand against his shoulder. "That's what this is, isn't it?" He nodded slowly, though something about the phrase didn't sit right. He poured another drink and walked toward the window, staring out into the dark city. Somewhere out there, Eleanor was rebuilding her life from scratch, in a world without luxury, without comfort, without power. And for a reason he couldn't explain, that thought unsettled him more than anything Olivia had said that night. The early spring air carried with it a faint promise of renewal, but for Alexander Hartley, everything still felt exactly the same. Each morning began with the scent of his cologne, the meticulous shine of his cufflinks, and the quiet hum of an espresso machine echoing through the penthouse. He would check the financial reports on his tablet while Olivia, always perfectly dressed and poised, breezed in and out of the kitchen, offering reminders about meetings and appointments. On the surface, their lives seemed like a polished portrait of modern success. Two ambitious minds aligned, sophisticated and unstoppable. But under that glossy frame, small fractures had begun to form, and neither of them noticed how deep they were spreading. In public, they were radiant. Together, they graced the covers of financial magazines, hosted black-tie galas, and charmed their way through networking events. Olivia had fully assumed the role Eleanor had once quietly fulfilled, appearing beside Alexander at every gathering, taking notes, charming stakeholders, curating the narrative of a seamless transition. But unlike Eleanor, Olivia wasn't content with standing beside power. She wanted to hold it, mold it, bend it toward her own purpose. Alexander admired her for that. At first, it felt electric. But that electricity had started to burn at the edges of their partnership, and he didn't yet know whether the heat would forge something stronger or consume everything they'd built. Behind closed doors, Olivia had become more assertive, pushing for more control over operations, questioning his decisions in tones just soft enough to sound supportive but sharp enough to leave a mark. She began meeting with clients without informing him, adjusting timelines, making unilateral decisions about branding strategies, all under the guise of efficiency. Alexander would confront her gently at first, saying things like, "You could have just run that by me," or "Next time, let's review things together first." Olivia would smile, kiss his cheek, and say, "I'm just trying to help, Alex. You've got too much on your plate." At first, he believed it. But slowly, doubts crept in, subtle and persistent. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Eleanor was quietly preparing her own battlefield. The studio space had transformed remarkably in just a few weeks. Where once there had been bare concrete and scattered debris, now stood warm lighting fixtures, hand-picked artwork, clean tables with thoughtful floral arrangements, and an open floor plan ready for workshops and collaboration. The place didn't scream luxury, but it spoke of intent, an elegant, grounded space designed not to impress, but to empower. Eleanor hadn't intended to rush into anything, but the momentum had taken on a life of its own. Word had spread faster than she anticipated. Celia had introduced her to a few contacts, local entrepreneurs, writers, speakers, and before she knew it, Eleanor was hosting strategy sessions for women re-entering the workforce, offering consultations to small business owners, and mentoring young professionals. She had quietly become a name people trusted, not because of her association with Alexander Hartley, but in spite of it. In those circles, Eleanor wasn't the ex-wife of a millionaire. She was a mentor, a guide, someone who understood the quiet battles women faced and how to outmaneuver them without ever raising a sword. But Eleanor wasn't building for revenge. She was building to remember who she was. Still, she wasn't naive. She knew Alexander was watching. He hadn't contacted her directly, but there were signs. Mutual acquaintances suddenly asking pointed questions, business partners of his showing up at her events pretending not to know her history. She handled it all with grace, never flinching, never giving anything away. It wasn't a war she wanted. But if one came, she was ready now. One afternoon, while reviewing her calendar at the studio, she received an unexpected call from Jonathan Marks, a respected investor who had once been a key player in one of Alexander's major acquisitions. They had met briefly years ago, at a fundraiser, and she barely remembered the conversation. Yet here he was, asking if she'd be open to a meeting. He said he'd heard of her recent work, that her vision intrigued him. She hesitated for a moment before agreeing to meet the next day. When she arrived at the quiet, upscale restaurant, she was surprised to find Jonathan already seated, reviewing a document. He stood when he saw her, offering a warm, respectful handshake. "Eleanor," he said with a smile. "Thank you for coming on short notice. I've been hearing your name a lot lately." "That's unexpected," she replied with a calm smile. "But I'll take it as a compliment." Jonathan chuckled. "It should be. What you're doing, it's smart, grounded, and frankly, it's more aligned with where the market is heading than most of the inflated nonsense I see in boardrooms." She tilted her head. I didn't realize you were keeping tabs on grassroots initiatives. I wasn't, he admitted, until yours started making ripples. Your events aren't just local chatter. People are talking. And not just about the work you're doing, but about you. Eleanor stayed quiet, not entirely sure where this conversation was going. I know you were never just the woman behind Alexander Hartley, he continued. But the world didn't always see that. Now they do. And that matters. What exactly are you suggesting? She asked. Jonathan leaned in slightly. I'm suggesting we consider a partnership. I have a few portfolios I've been waiting to transition into community-based development and education-forward enterprise. Your model fits better than anything else I've reviewed in months. Eleanor sat back, measuring his words carefully. It wasn't just a compliment. It was a doorway, one she hadn't even considered before. Let me think about it, she said after a pause. Of course, Jonathan replied, but the look in his eyes told her he knew she wouldn't say no. Not forever. That evening, she returned home with 1,000 thoughts swirling in her head. She sat at the kitchen table, opened her notebook, and began outlining ideas. Her hand moved quickly, the words flowing with clarity. She wasn't just playing defense anymore. She was drawing her own plans. Back in the penthouse, Alexander was pacing his office. A quiet tension had hung over the apartment all week. The financial report he received that morning showed a slow, inexplicable drop in projected revenue from several of his key accounts. He'd spent hours trying to trace it. Clients weren't returning calls as promptly. Partners were stalling on deliverables. Nothing catastrophic yet, but enough to raise alarm. He suspected sabotage, or maybe poor execution. He couldn't decide which thought bothered him more. Olivia entered the room, phone in hand, lips pursed. You're not listening to me anymore, she said bluntly. He turned sharply. What are you talking about? You're paranoid. You've second-guessed every move I've made this week. You don't trust me. I'm seeing cracks in deals we should have secured months ago. Maybe the cracks were already there. Maybe you just didn't see them because you were too busy blaming everyone else. Her tone was sharp now, unapologetic. He stepped closer. Are you saying this is my fault? I'm saying, she replied, eyes locked on his, that maybe not everything falling apart is about me. He stared at her, unsure what to say. Olivia walked out before he could respond. That night, as Alexander stood by the window nursing a drink, he caught his reflection again. But this time, it looked different. Not like a titan, not like a man in control. It looked like a man who had won a war and now had no idea how to rule peace. And somewhere across town, Eleanor was reading through a new proposal from Jonathan Marks, a soft smile forming on her lips as the wind rustled through the open window. She closed her notebook, leaned back in her chair, and realized something she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't rebuilding anymore. She was rising. The evening was thick with warmth, the kind that wrapped itself around you like velvet, heavy and indulgent. The Hartley penthouse was dressed to impress, as usual. Crystal vases overflowed with white orchids, champagne flutes lined the marble counters, and soft ambient lighting glowed from the recessed fixtures above. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city buzzed in glittering lights, a living backdrop to yet another carefully orchestrated event. This time, it was a private pre-gala reception, a gathering for influential figures in finance, media, and politics. The kind of night where deals were whispered behind smiles and power exchanged hands between toasts. Alexander stood at the center of it all, tailored to perfection in a midnight blue tuxedo, his cufflinks catching the light as he greeted guests with a practiced warmth. He moved through the room like a conductor, charming investors, shaking hands with CEOs, posing briefly for the photographers invited in just long enough to capture the right image, and then ushered out before anyone became too candid. Beside him, Olivia played her role with precision. Her floor-length silk gown clung to her form, every detail of her appearance curated to reflect status, sophistication, and beauty. Her laughter punctuated the conversations in just the right places, her eyes glinting with a familiarity that made people lean in, trust her, tell her things they wouldn't normally say. She knew exactly how to stand just a few inches behind Alexander, close enough to signify importance, distant enough to appear respectful. She was flawless, but something lingered beneath the polish of the evening, a subtle dissonance, invisible to most but tangible to anyone watching closely. There was a tension in Alexander's jaw when no one was looking, a stiffness in Olivia's smile when he corrected her in front of others. Their connection, once electric and impulsive, had cooled into a partnership that was beginning to resemble a negotiation more than a relationship. They exchanged glances across the room, not in longing, but in silent calculations. It was no longer about attraction, it was about alignment, positioning, advantage. While the guests drank imported wine and made quiet business arrangements, Eleanor walked into a quiet bookstore on the other side of town. It was one of those places tucked between a dry cleaner and a florist, with wooden floors that creaked and the scent of old paper hanging in the air. She had promised herself she'd stop by after dinner with Ryan, a rare moment when he seemed genuinely excited to share something from his literature class. They wandered through the aisles together, Ryan pointing out books he needed, Eleanor running her fingers along the spines of titles she hadn't thought about in years. There was something grounding about the place, something real. As she reached for a book on a high shelf, her phone buzzed in her bag. A message from Celia. We have a confirmed date for the launch. Next Friday. Everything's moving quickly. You ready? Eleanor stared at the message for a long moment before typing her reply. Yes, let's do it. That one word, ready, carried weight now. Not long ago, she would have hesitated, second-guessed herself, worried about logistics, worried about failure. But something had shifted. She wasn't asking for permission anymore. She was moving, building, claiming space. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of how much she wanted it. Back at the penthouse, a guest whispered something in Olivia's ear that made her freeze for just a fraction of a second. Alexander noticed the shift in her expression, subtle but unmistakable. When the guest moved on, he stepped closer. What was that about? He asked quietly. Olivia's lips tightened. Nothing important. Olivia, he said, his voice low. Don't treat me like an investor you're trying to pacify. What did he say? She hesitated before answering. He mentioned Eleanor. Said she's hosting a launch event next week. Apparently, it's gaining a lot of attention in certain circles. Alexander blinked. What kind of event? I don't know. Some kind of business initiative. A consultancy or mentorship program. He didn't have details. Just said her name's being talked about again. Alexander laughed under his breath, but it wasn't amusement, it was disbelief. She's throwing networking parties now. She's building something, Alex. People are paying attention. His face darkened. People pay attention to anything new for 5 minutes. That doesn't mean it's meaningful. Maybe, Olivia said, then turned to refill her glass. But the conversation stuck with him. Later that night, after the guests had left and the staff had begun clearing away the remnants of the evening, Alexander sat on the terrace alone, glass in hand, staring out over the city. The music inside had stopped, but his thoughts kept playing on loop. He hadn't thought about Eleanor's ambitions in years. He assumed she had none. Not anymore. That had always been the difference between them. He moved forward, she maintained. He pushed boundaries, she kept things steady. Or so he thought. He picked up his phone and did something he hadn't done in a long time. He searched her name. Articles popped up immediately. Features on local platforms, interviews with industry publications, blog posts from attendees praising her workshops. A video clip from one of her talks at a small business conference appeared at the top of the results. He clicked play. There she was, standing in front of a small audience, poised and articulate, speaking about resilience and reinvention, about finding value in experience and navigating life transitions with dignity and clarity. She wasn't bitter or emotional. She wasn't referencing him or their past. She wasn't selling anything flashy or promising overnight success. She was simply speaking with truth. And people were listening. He watched the entire video in silence. When it ended, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the dark sky. He didn't know what unsettled him more, the fact that she had found her voice, or the realization that he had never truly heard it while they were married. The next morning, Olivia noticed the shift in him. He was distant, preoccupied. When she mentioned their upcoming gala appearance, he waved her off. You handle it, he said without looking up from his tablet. She studied him for a moment, then walked away without another word. Meanwhile, across town, Eleanor stood in the center of her studio space, watching her team arrange chairs and equipment for the event. Banners were going up, food vendors were setting up outside, and volunteers were distributing welcome packets. The room buzzed with energy, and for the first time in a long while, Eleanor didn't feel like an outsider looking in. She felt like she belonged in the middle of it all. Not as a guest, not as someone's plus one, not as a passive observer, but as a creator, a leader, a woman with her own name, her own vision, her own narrative. She walked over to a corner where Ryan was helping a technician set up a projector. He turned to her with a rare smile. "This looks amazing, Mom." "Thanks," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's just the beginning." Outside, guests began to arrive, some familiar, some new, all curious. As Eleanor stood near the entrance greeting people, she noticed one attendee lingering near the door, clearly hesitant to enter. A woman in her early 30s, clutching a notebook, looking unsure. Eleanor walked over with a warm smile. "First time?" she asked gently. The woman nodded. "I almost didn't come. I didn't think I'd fit in." "You already do," Eleanor replied. "Come on in." And just like that, another story began. The sound of Olivia's heels echoed across the marble floors of the Hartley penthouse, rhythmic and sharp, cutting through the soft silence of the early evening. She moved through the space with purpose, her phone pressed to her ear, issuing clipped instructions to a catering coordinator regarding an upcoming dinner she was hosting for a new client. Alexander, meanwhile, sat on the living room couch, his attention fixed on the news ticker running along the bottom of the television screen. His mind was elsewhere, detached, processing conversations that hadn't yet happened and thoughts he didn't quite know how to articulate. He had been quieter lately, less present. He responded to emails without his usual urgency, skimmed financial reports instead of dissecting them line by line, and passed off more meetings to his junior partners. Olivia had noticed. She hadn't said anything at first. She preferred to observe before confronting, but now the shift in his behavior was starting to concern her. He wasn't distracted in the usual sense. He wasn't preoccupied with business strategy or new investments. It was something deeper, something that unsettled her, though she couldn't name it. "You're not sleeping," she said plainly that night as she entered the bedroom and found him staring at the ceiling, the light from his tablet casting a soft glow on his face. He glanced at her. "I'm just thinking." "You've been just thinking for 2 weeks." He didn't answer immediately. He set the tablet aside and sat up, running a hand through his hair. "I've been reading about Eleanor." Olivia stiffened. "Why?" "Because I want to understand what she's doing. How it's gaining traction. How it's reaching people I didn't even think she could influence." Olivia sat at the edge of the bed, her expression unreadable. "Maybe it's nothing. A few flattering articles, some well-timed praise. It happens. People love a comeback story. But this doesn't feel temporary," Alexander said, his voice lower now. "It feels deliberate." Olivia didn't reply. She stood, walked over to her vanity, and began removing her earrings one by one. "Are you regretting something, Alex?" He met her gaze in the mirror. "No, I'm observing." But Olivia had known him long enough to recognize that tone. It was the same one he used when he started to question the value of a business partnership, when he began reassessing risk. It was the sound of calculations being reworked beneath the surface, and it irritated her. She had worked too hard, moved too strategically, to have him suddenly distracted by the echo of a life he had discarded. The next day, Alexander attended a luncheon hosted by the Chamber of Commerce, an annual event he had never missed. The room was filled with familiar faces, executives, donors, journalists, socialites. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like the center of gravity in the room. Conversations moved past him, laughter erupted from tables he wasn't seated at, and the keynote speaker, someone he once mentored, barely acknowledged him during the speech. It wasn't overt. It wasn't disrespectful. It was just different. Subtle shifts in posture. Tones of polite detachment. The kind of social maneuvering that indicated a change in alliances. And then he heard it. Her name. "Did you hear about Eleanor Hartley's latest partnership? She's doing something incredible with community enterprise funding. It's more sustainable than anything Hartley's pushed in years." He wasn't meant to hear it, but he did. And it stayed with him. Later that evening, back at the penthouse, Olivia found him in his study, surrounded by open folders, reports, and a bottle of whiskey half-finished beside him. He didn't acknowledge her presence right away. He was too absorbed in a document he had pulled from one of his storage archives, an old strategic outline that Eleanor had once drafted in the early years of his company's expansion. He had mocked it at the time, calling it too idealistic, too focused on long-term impact instead of short-term gain. But now, reading through her notes again, He saw things differently. There was structure in her vision, depth in her analysis. Ideas he had discarded as impractical now seemed prophetic. She was ahead of me in some ways, he said quietly when he noticed Olivia standing there. She raised an eyebrow. Excuse me, Eleanor. She was thinking about things I never paid attention to. Olivia crossed her arms, irritation simmering beneath the surface. And what exactly are you trying to say? I'm not saying anything, he replied, his voice calm but distant. I'm realizing things. Olivia turned and walked away without another word, retreating to the bedroom, where she closed the door with more force than necessary. Meanwhile, in her studio, Eleanor was finalizing plans for a new series of mentorship programs. The launch event had gone better than she expected. Several attendees had approached her afterward with requests for collaborations. 2 local investors wanted to fund her next phase. One woman, a young founder struggling with investor intimidation, had written Eleanor a letter that made her cry. Not out of sadness, but recognition. In the young woman's story, she saw pieces of her younger self. The version of her that had once stood beside Alexander, full of ideas but told to stay in her lane. She spent hours every night reviewing plans, refining concepts, creating frameworks. Ryan often sat on the couch nearby, earbuds in, typing away at his assignments. They didn't talk much during those late hours, but they didn't need to. Their silent companionship was enough. It was a new rhythm, a new kind of family. Quieter, but fuller in ways she hadn't anticipated. One evening, as she was sorting through old boxes for reference materials, she found something she hadn't seen in years, a photograph of her and Alexander at one of their first business retreats. He had his arm around her shoulder, and they were both laughing, their expressions unguarded and hopeful. She stared at it for a long time, not with longing, but with a strange sense of detachment. That moment, that version of them, didn't exist anymore, and it didn't need to. She placed the photo back in the box, then paused and pulled out a different envelope, a letter she had written during the final days of their marriage but never sent. It wasn't a love letter. It was a document, a record, a detailed summary of specific financial decisions made during their marriage. Decisions she had questioned at the time, decisions he had dismissed. But now, rereading the figures and her annotations, she realized something she hadn't before. Certain assets, real estate holdings, dormant accounts, licensing rights, had been moved without formal documentation. Some of those decisions, if traced properly, could open a door she hadn't considered before. She took a deep breath, closed the envelope, and set it aside. Not as a threat, not as ammunition, but as a possibility. A lever, if needed. Back at the penthouse, Olivia found herself increasingly unsettled. She noticed Alexander's growing silence, his withdrawal. She saw the way he now analyzed everything twice, how he started revisiting projects she thought had been buried. He was unraveling in his own way, not in dramatic explosions, but in subtle recalibrations. And worse, he had begun locking his office door when she wasn't around. One afternoon, while he was out, she wandered into his office and began leafing through his desk. Nothing unusual at first, just reports, files, correspondence. But then she found a folder labeled Hartley Provisional Holdings. Inside were documents she had never seen before, shell company transfers, offshore accounts, hidden equity shares. It wasn't illegal, but it wasn't clean either. And she wondered how much Eleanor knew, how much she had signed unknowingly, how much she had documented. The pieces were moving, but Olivia couldn't tell yet who was playing the better game, and neither could Alexander. It was early morning when the first shipment of gold-trimmed invitations was delivered to the penthouse. Olivia stood in the foyer, watching the staff carry in box after box of custom-stamped envelopes tied with silk ribbons. The smell of fresh paper and glue lingered in the air as she opened one of the boxes, pulling out a single invitation and running her fingers along the embossed lettering. Everything had been handcrafted in Paris, just as she wanted. Alexander had approved the design weeks earlier, more out of convenience than enthusiasm, and now the official countdown had begun. Their wedding would take place in exactly 32 days. In public, the announcement had already circulated. Social columns called it the most anticipated union of the year, a merging of power and beauty, wealth and ambition. Olivia's face had appeared on the covers of bridal editorials, hailed as the new muse of modern luxury. Alexander, while more reserved in his participation, had agreed to one high-profile interview about the engagement, describing his future bride as brilliant, elegant, and everything I never knew I needed. The line had been scripted by his publicist, but Olivia had smiled proudly when she heard it. It had played well. Behind the scenes, however, the wedding planning was less romantic and more mechanical. Olivia's mood had grown sharper. She barked at assistants who missed details, dismissed vendors who didn't meet her standards, and revised the seating chart a dozen times before breakfast. Her stress leaked into every room she entered. She started micromanaging the florists, demanding that the arrangements felt more timeless, whatever that meant, and sent the cake designer back to the drawing board 3 times because the design felt too traditional. She needed everything to be perfect, not for Alexander, not even for herself, but for the image she was crafting. This wedding was her coronation, and she would not let anyone forget it. Alexander, meanwhile, had become more withdrawn. He allowed Olivia to handle the details, nodding in meetings, approving invoices without reading them, showing up when required. But his mind was elsewhere. His thoughts wandered too easily to Eleanor, what she was doing, what she was building, how her name kept reappearing in circles he once dominated without challenge. At first, he had dismissed it as noise. Then it became an echo. Now it felt like a presence, something tangible, even though she hadn't stepped near his world in months. Or so he thought. What he didn't know was that Eleanor had already been invited. The moment the wedding announcement hit the press, a subtle ripple moved through the social fabric Eleanor now navigated with quiet dignity. Her new partners, clients, and collaborators all saw it. Some brought it up gently, others with thinly veiled curiosity. But Eleanor said nothing. She simply smiled and moved on with her day. Her studio continued to thrive. The mentorship program expanded. A podcast producer reached out about featuring her. A publishing agent expressed interest in a book. She moved forward, not out of spite, but from a place of reclaimed purpose. Yet somewhere in the back of her mind, something twisted at the thought of Olivia in a white gown standing beside Alexander. Not because she wanted him back, she didn't, but because it reminded her of the way she had once been presented, polished and posed, as an accessory to his empire. And she wondered if Olivia knew what it truly meant to be that woman. It was Celia who suggested it. Send him something, she said over coffee one afternoon. Not out of bitterness. Out of strategy. You're playing chess now, Eleanor. Stop pretending you're not. Eleanor had laughed at first. What would I even send him? Celia had leaned in, eyes glinting with mischief. Send him a memory. Eleanor thought about it for days. She didn't want drama. She didn't want to provoke. But a memory, yes. That was something else. That was a message only Alexander would understand. Something private, layered, wrapped in subtlety. Not a threat. A reminder of who she was, of what she knew. The following week, while Olivia busied herself with menu tastings and calligraphy decisions, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, drafting a letter. The words came slowly at first, then poured out in clean, deliberate lines. She didn't mention love. She didn't mention the past. She spoke of business, of integrity, of records. She referenced things only he would remember, certain transactions, specific dates, moments he thought she had forgotten or ignored. She didn't accuse. She hinted. She didn't demand. She observed. And then, at the end, she included a simple statement that would feel innocuous to anyone else, but land like a thunderclap to Alexander. I've been reviewing old files, just out of curiosity. It's remarkable how much we overlook when we trust too easily. She printed it, folded it neatly, placed it in an envelope, and addressed it by hand. To Alexander Hartley. No return address. No signature. Just an elegant envelope, delivered by courier to the venue hosting the wedding rehearsal dinner. The envelope arrived on a Friday, late in the afternoon, just as the event coordinator was finalizing the lighting setup for the ballroom. The courier handed it to the front desk with instructions that it be delivered directly to the groom's suite. No exceptions. The staff followed orders. The envelope was placed on a side table in Alexander's suite, where it sat unnoticed for several hours amidst fabric swatches, seating charts, and bottles of champagne. When he finally found it, he assumed it was from a vendor. He opened it casually, without anticipation. But as his eyes scanned the letter, his expression changed. The first few lines were confusing, then familiar, then unsettling. He read it twice, then a third time. By the fourth read, his hands were trembling slightly. He didn't say anything at first. Olivia was in the next room, arguing with the stylist over tie colors. Alexander sat in silence, staring at the letter, trying to piece together what it meant, what it implied. He couldn't understand why it rattled him so deeply. There was nothing overtly threatening about it, but there was weight in its restraint. He could feel it. Eleanor had written not as a woman seeking reconciliation or revenge, but as a strategist reclaiming her place at the table. When Olivia entered the room, she noticed the shift in his demeanor. "What's wrong?" she asked, reaching for her glass of wine. He folded the letter quickly and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "Nothing," he said. "Just a reminder of something I need to review." But his tone betrayed him. That night, as they stood on the stage during the rehearsal, posing for photos and thanking guests, Alexander's mind remained elsewhere. He wasn't listening to the toasts. He wasn't hearing the music. His thoughts kept circling back to Eleanor's letter, to her words, to the way she had timed it perfectly, days before the wedding, in the middle of his most triumphant moment. He glanced across the room at Olivia, radiant and powerful in her tailored dress, laughing with a group of designers. And for the first time, he wondered how much she really knew. About him, about his business, about everything that had come before her. He didn't sleep that night. In the early hours of the morning, long after Olivia had drifted off, he rose from bed and stood by the window, staring into the city. The skyline hadn't changed, but something in him had. He couldn't name it yet, but it was there, quiet and steady, like the slow shifting of tectonic plates. And somewhere across town, Eleanor sat in her studio, alone, sipping tea as she read through the final draft of her upcoming keynote address. The light was soft, the air still. She didn't know how he would react to the letter, but she didn't need to know. She had already done what she came to do. The wedding day approached with the precision of a ticking clock, its rhythm etched into every task, every delivery, every whispered instruction between stylists and planners. The venue had been transformed into a vision of grandeur, with cascading white roses adorning the archways and satin runners stretching across polished floors. Everything sparkled, every corner meticulously crafted to reflect opulence and sophistication. It was the kind of event that people would talk about for months, a display of wealth disguised as a celebration of love, carefully packaged for the cameras and society columns. But beneath the surface, something unspoken stirred. Alexander Hartley felt it like a low hum in his bones, a sound no one else could hear, but one he couldn't ignore anymore. He moved through the hours with mechanical grace, nodding at guests, approving last-minute details, shaking hands with suppliers and staff. Olivia remained radiant, smiling through interviews, directing photographers, and posing for promotional footage. She looked every bit the part, elegant, graceful, poised, but behind her eyes was a glint of something harder. She wasn't just preparing to become a wife. She was preparing to solidify her status, to claim the final piece of a kingdom she had worked tirelessly to infiltrate. She saw this ceremony not as a beginning, but as a culmination. The moment when everything she had worked for finally became hers. But Alexander's thoughts were no longer focused on the ceremony. The letter from Eleanor had burrowed deep into his psyche, and the more he tried to dismiss it, the louder its implications became. He had reread it more times than he would admit, each time uncovering new subtext, subtle threats veiled in neutrality. There were lines referencing specific financial structures from years ago, things he thought only he had known, decisions made in backrooms, documents signed in haste, assets rerouted through shell companies to protect investments. At the time, he believed Eleanor had merely signed what he told her to sign. Now he wasn't so sure. That uncertainty gnawed at him. He began to retrace steps he hadn't thought about in years. In the days leading up to the wedding, while Olivia was preoccupied with fittings and rehearsals, he spent hours locked in his home office, pulling old records, revisiting tax filings, reviewing legal agreements that had collected dust in his archives. The more he uncovered, the more questions formed. Some assets weren't listed under his name anymore. Others had inexplicably shifted ownership years prior. Small, seemingly insignificant transactions at the time, now revealing patterns he couldn't fully explain. And then there were the dormant accounts. The ones he had forgotten entirely, tied to projects that never launched, companies that existed only on paper. Eleanor had signed off on some of them. But she had also requested copies of everything. He remembered now how she would ask for duplicates, quietly, without making a scene. How she kept her own files, organized and color-coded. At the time, he thought it was habit, maybe a way to feel involved. But what if it had been preparation? What if, even then, she had known? The realization was slow, heavy. He poured himself a drink late one night and stood by the window, watching the city stretch into the distance, glinting under the weight of its own secrets. He had always believed he was untouchable, that Eleanor was too kind, too gentle, too passive to ever challenge him. But maybe that had been the greatest mistake of all, confusing quiet with weakness. Across town, Eleanor sat at her desk, flipping through a binder of financial records, each page a silent testament to the years she had spent by Alexander's side. She hadn't looked at these documents in a long time, but now, with everything unfolding as it was, she wanted to be certain of what she knew. She wasn't planning to expose him, not publicly. That wasn't her aim. But if it came to a battle, if he ever tried to challenge her standing, to erase her from business dealings or manipulate assets she had a rightful share in, she would be ready. Not just with emotion, but with facts. Cold, clean facts. Her fingers brushed against an old photo tucked between pages, a picture of her younger self, standing beside Alexander during a groundbreaking ceremony. She looked different then. Softer, maybe. More hopeful. She held the photo for a moment, then set it aside. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone forged by years of compromise, silence, and now, clarity. Celia arrived shortly after, carrying a folder of her own. I went through the rest of the records, she said, dropping the file onto the table. You were right. Some of the transfers look questionable. Can we prove it? Eleanor asked. Not in court, not without more. But we can raise enough doubt to make him sweat. And in his world, doubt is poison. Eleanor nodded slowly. I don't want to destroy him. I just want to make sure he knows I'm not invisible anymore. Celia smiled. Oh, he knows. The question is, what will he do about it? Meanwhile, Olivia had begun to feel the shift in Alexander's demeanor. He was no longer interested in the final fittings, no longer eager to talk about honeymoon plans or press coverage. He answered her questions with half-hearted nods, stared past her when she spoke, and disappeared into his office for hours without explanation. When she confronted him, he dismissed her concerns. I'm managing pre-wedding logistics, he said. Since when do you care about floral invoices and floor plans? She asked. He turned to her, tired eyes meeting hers. There are things you don't understand, Olivia. Then make me understand, she challenged. But he didn't. Instead, he grew quieter, more closed off, and Olivia, for all her confidence and control, began to feel something unfamiliar creeping in, unease. Then came the rehearsal dinner. The venue was grand, filled with laughter, expensive wines, and speeches from friends and colleagues. Alexander stood at the head of the table, raising a glass to toast the future, his words eloquent but hollow. Olivia beamed beside him, her smile dazzling, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of imperfection. And then, just as dessert was served, a server approached Alexander discreetly and handed him a small box wrapped in elegant paper. He looked at it curiously. No card, no sender listed, just a delicate ribbon and an envelope inside with his name printed in familiar handwriting. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single object, a gold bracelet. Simple, classic. The same bracelet he had once given Eleanor on their 10th anniversary. The same bracelet she had worn religiously for years. He recognized it immediately. But it wasn't the bracelet itself that stopped him cold. It was the note beneath it. Some things you try to replace. Others return to remind you they were never truly gone. He stared at it for a long time, his fingers curling around the metal. Olivia noticed the shift in his face. What is it? He didn't answer. Because in that moment, something unspoken clicked into place. The past wasn't echoing anymore. It was speaking. The sun had barely risen over the skyline when Alexander Hartley stepped into the quiet suite reserved for him on the top floor of the wedding venue. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a painting, and the room was immaculate, untouched, almost sterile in its elegance. Everything was exactly as Olivia had arranged. Silver cufflinks laid neatly on the dresser, his custom tuxedo hanging perfectly pressed beside the wardrobe. Even the cologne bottle placed just slightly off-center as if to remind him of the ritual of perfection. But nothing about this morning felt perfect to him. His chest was heavy with unease, and sleep had never come the night before. He had tossed beneath silk sheets, haunted not by dreams, but by silence. The kind of silence that fills a room louder than any sound ever could. The kind that presses into your thoughts and won't leave you alone. He walked to the desk, intent on reviewing his notes for the ceremony. Olivia had insisted they write their own vows, but paused when he noticed an envelope placed precisely at the edge of the surface. It wasn't there the night before. This one was different from the others he'd received. No shimmering gold trim, no engraved initials. Just plain ivory paper, sealed with a simple wax stamp. No name on the outside. But he didn't need one. He knew who had sent it. His fingers trembled slightly as he broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The paper was heavy, textured, deliberately chosen. The handwriting was unmistakably Eleanor's. Elegant, controlled, deeply familiar. He took a breath, bracing himself, and began to read. It didn't start with bitterness. There was no accusation, no venom, no emotional pleading. It began with calm reflection. She wrote about time, about how it stretches and folds when you least expect it. She wrote about the way trust can become invisible until it's gone, about how silence sometimes speaks more clearly than words. And then, without ceremony, she began to write in detail. She listed dates, specific dates, transactions, agreements, company names, ones he hadn't heard in years. She referenced bank transfers, shell corporations, asset relocations. Some he remembered, some he had forgotten entirely. But what stunned him wasn't just the knowledge she had. It was the way she had put it all together. With methodical precision, Eleanor had taken years of passive observations and turned them into something sharp, something lethal. She pointed out inconsistencies he never imagined anyone would catch. She outlined discrepancies that no accountant had ever flagged. She didn't accuse him of anything illegal. She didn't need to. She simply laid out a picture so clear, so undeniable, that it became a quiet threat all on its own. And then, near the end, her tone shifted. "I never wanted war, Alexander," she wrote. "But I also refused to be erased. You taught me that empires are built on leverage. I have mine now. I don't intend to use it, unless I'm forced to. Consider this letter a courtesy, a reminder that some women don't burn bridges. They build ones you never saw coming." His hands were sweating. His throat was dry. He read the letter again, slower this time, trying to find loopholes, gaps, mistakes. But there were none. Eleanor had always been meticulous, and now he saw just how much of that he had underestimated. He folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, sitting down heavily in the leather chair beside the window. Outside, the city was waking up, but inside him, something was unraveling. His mind raced with scenarios. Could she truly access those documents? Were the companies still legally tied to her name? Could she prove the asset transfers? He remembered now. She had insisted her name remain on some paperwork just for safety, and he had agreed, distracted by more urgent deals. He had dismissed her requests as harmless, naive. But now, those minor decisions could become catastrophic. There was a knock at the door. Olivia's voice came through softly. "Alex, you okay?" He didn't respond immediately. He ran a hand through his hair, swallowed hard, and forced his voice into calmness. "I'm fine. I just need a minute. Everyone's waiting downstairs. The photographer wants pre-ceremony shots. I'll be there soon." Silence. Then her footsteps retreated down the hallway. He stood slowly, walked to the mirror, and stared at his reflection. He looked the same, immaculately dressed, groomed, composed, but the man in the mirror felt like a stranger. He was no longer the titan in control. He was a man standing on a precipice, uncertain of the ground beneath his feet. He reached into the jacket pocket of his suit and placed the letter inside, folding it neatly. He wasn't sure why he brought it. He just couldn't leave it behind. The ceremony began in a blur. The guests stood as Olivia walked down the aisle, resplendent in her designer gown, every movement rehearsed, every detail flawless. The music swelled, camera shutters clicked, and Alexander smiled on cue. But inside, his thoughts were somewhere else. On the letter, on Eleanor's words, on the terrifying clarity of what had just been placed into his hands. He stumbled slightly on his vows. No one noticed but Olivia. She gave him a subtle glance, a warning look, as if to say, "Don't ruin this." He recovered quickly, forced a laugh, delivered his lines. But the weight of the letter pressed against his chest like a stone. After the ceremony, as guests toasted and mingled, Alexander excused himself under the guise of making a call. He slipped into a private lounge room, locked the door, and pulled out the letter again. He read it one last time, slower this time, letting every sentence settle in his mind like a lead weight. There was no denying it now. Eleanor had power, real power, and he had handed it to her, unknowingly, over years of arrogance and assumption. He had replaced her thinking he was upgrading, but he had never truly seen her. Not really. He had underestimated her intelligence, her foresight, her ability to navigate complexity with silence instead of noise. And now, she held his empire in her hands, not in courtrooms or headlines, but in quiet, calculated leverage that could dismantle him if she chose to act. He sat there for a long time, the letter resting in his lap, the sounds of laughter and celebration echoing faintly through the walls. He knew he couldn't go back to the ceremony and pretend anymore. Something had shifted. A truth had been revealed, not just about Eleanor, but about himself. And he wasn't sure which one scared him more. The morning after the wedding began in silence, not the kind that accompanied comfort or intimacy, but the kind that filled a space with unspoken tension. The kind that made each sound, a footstep, a creak of a chair, the soft clink of a coffee cup, feel unnaturally loud. Alexander sat alone at the breakfast table in the honeymoon suite, staring at a plate of untouched food. Olivia had left earlier to attend an impromptu press interview about the ceremony, radiant and full of strategic smiles. He hadn't gone with her. He'd barely spoken since the night before. The letter from Eleanor still weighed heavy in his pocket, though he had read it a dozen times now. It wasn't just the content, it was the consequence. The realization that everything he thought was untouchable had already begun to shift beneath his feet. He had tried to ignore it during the celebration, had forced himself through speeches, posed for photos, kissed Olivia's hand at every turn, but now, in the aftermath, all that remained was an empty room and 1,000 questions. His phone vibrated on the table. A notification. He picked it up, half distracted, but his breath caught in his throat when he read it. A flagged alert from his private banking advisor. Unusual activity detected. He opened the message. Several accounts were being placed under temporary audit, flagged for inconsistencies in account ownership. The audit had been initiated not by the bank itself, but by an internal oversight trigger, something buried deep in the system, programmed to respond to suspicious transfers tied to dormant corporate entities. Entities tied to his name. Entities that, years ago, had also been signed off under Eleanor's name. At first, he thought it had to be a mistake. He reached for his laptop and immediately logged into his secure platform. The screen lit up with warnings. Restricted access. Pending investigations. Then came the calls, one from his legal advisor, another from his investment manager, both alerting him of discrepancies in asset records. Licensing rights previously believed to be under his name were now in dispute. Documents dated from over a decade ago were resurfacing, revealing small but crucial details he had overlooked. Quiet clauses, signed agreements, notarized signatures, most of which bore Eleanor's initials alongside his. His head spun. The empire he had spent years building felt like it was crumbling from the inside. It wasn't a public scandal yet, but it was no longer silent, and it would grow louder. Olivia returned just as he was closing his laptop, her voice filled with light chatter about how well the press responded, how the morning segment had gone viral, how beautiful the photos were. She didn't notice his expression until she poured her coffee and looked over at him. "What's wrong?" she asked. He didn't respond right away. He just stared at her, blinking slowly, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. She asked again, sharper this time. "Alex, what happened?" He slid the laptop toward her and opened the flagged banking dashboard. She stared at the screen, then at him. "What is this?" "An audit," he said flatly, triggered by a series of old account transfers. The kind I never thought would be questioned. The kind I never thought she would remember. "Eleanor," Olivia whispered. He nodded. "I thought you said it was nothing, that she was just posturing. I was wrong." For a moment, Olivia said nothing. Then she stood, pacing the room, processing the implications. "Okay, we'll call the legal team. We'll freeze the exposure. We can contain it." It's not just about freezing anything, Alexander replied, his voice lower now. She's not coming after me publicly. She's undermining me privately. She's exposing every weak point I never reinforced. Olivia turned to him, frustration rising. How did this even happen? You've had full control over everything for years. He looked at her, finally letting the truth settle between them. I never actually had full control. I just thought I did. The words hung in the air like a confession. Olivia didn't respond right away. She poured another cup of coffee, her hands trembling slightly. For the first time since the beginning of their relationship, she wasn't sure where she stood. Everything she had built with Alexander had been built on the assumption of his invincibility. If that crumbled, what was she left with? That afternoon, Alexander made calls. He tried to salvage what he could, reaching out to silent partners, revisiting old agreements, attempting to pull strings he hadn't needed to pull in years. But each call ended with hesitation, doubt, distance. The people who once rushed to return his messages now responded with caution, concern. He was no longer the untouchable figure they had once feared. He was vulnerable now, and power respects power, not fragility. By evening, another blow landed. An anonymous tip submitted to the Financial Integrity Bureau, questioning conflict of interest clauses in one of his international ventures. The tip didn't come from Eleanor. She hadn't moved directly, but the timing was no coincidence. She had stirred the water. Others were beginning to take notice. The sharks were circling. Olivia snapped later that night. She had been on the phone with a PR agent when she stormed into the study, slamming her phone on the desk. This is spiraling, Alex. People are already asking questions. Investors are nervous. We need to issue a statement. No, he said firmly. You want to just sit and let this explode? I said no. Her eyes narrowed. You're going to let her dismantle everything, and you're not going to fight back? He stood from his chair slowly. She's not dismantling anything. She's showing me where the cracks already were. You're being sentimental, Olivia said sharply. That's exactly how she's winning. No, he replied. She's winning because I thought she never could. The word struck her like a slap. She stared at him, stunned, realizing the foundation of their relationship was shifting. And for the first time, she understood that his loyalty, whatever version of it he had offered, was never truly hers. It had always been situational, conditional. And now, as his world trembled, he wasn't reaching for her. He was staring back into a past he had discarded, realizing that what he thought was dead had only been dormant. That night, while Olivia packed a suitcase in silence, Alexander sat by the window again, the letter in his hand. He read it one more time, slower this time, then set it down. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found her name. Eleanor Hartley. His finger hovered over the call button, but he didn't press it, because he knew, whatever he needed to say, whatever apology he might offer, it wouldn't change what had already begun. The collapse was already in motion. The suite was still in disarray when the sun rose again, casting soft, accusing light across the polished floors. Olivia's half-packed suitcase remained near the door, flaps open, clothes spilling out like unfinished thoughts. Alexander sat motionless in the armchair near the fireplace, eyes sunken, jaw clenched, fingers rubbing the edge of his temple in slow, mechanical circles. The silence wasn't new. It had lingered for days now, pressing in from every direction, but this morning it carried a new weight, a kind of finality that no words could disguise. He hadn't spoken to Olivia since the night before, and she hadn't pushed. Something between them had ruptured. Not with screaming, not with dramatic gestures, but with stillness, with absence, with all the things left unsaid that now echoed louder than any argument ever could. He thought of Eleanor constantly now, not with longing, but with a strange mix of regret and awe, as if he were only now seeing the full shape of the woman he had underestimated for so many years. He kept returning to that thought, that his greatest miscalculation hadn't been trusting her too little, but believing her too fragile to matter. She hadn't fought him with fury. She had fought him with foresight. She hadn't stormed the gates of his empire. She had simply waited for the right moment to show him that she still held the keys to more than he remembered. And now, every corner of his life, financial, professional, personal, was unraveling in ways he couldn't contain. By midday, another alert arrived. One of his primary overseas investments had been suspended due to a legal challenge from a regulatory board. He called his legal team, but their responses were tight, rehearsed, layered in warnings. The quiet loyalty that had once insulated him was evaporating. Some of his advisors were beginning to distance themselves, quietly reshuffling portfolios, preparing their exit strategies in case things worsened. One associate, a man who had once toasted to his brilliance, sent a vague email about postponing future projects. Alexander read the words twice, then deleted the message without replying. His reputation wasn't ruined yet, but it was wounded. And in his world, a wound was more dangerous than a scandal. Scandals could be spun. Wounds bled slowly, invisibly, until one day they collapsed everything from within. He tried to reach Ryan later that afternoon. He hadn't spoken to his son since the wedding. He dialed twice, then hung up before the call connected. He didn't know what he would say. He didn't know what kind of father he had become. He wondered what Eleanor had told him, if she had explained what was happening, if Ryan even cared. The distance between them now felt more vast than ever, a chasm too wide to cross with apologies. Olivia returned that evening, but the air between them remained stiff and brittle. She moved quietly through the suite, avoiding eye contact, responding to his questions with clipped answers. She didn't ask about the latest fallout. She didn't mention the letter again. She didn't press him for decisions about the next steps. Something had changed in her, too. Not a loss of ambition, but a loss of trust in the structure they had built together. She had believed in his invincibility, and now that illusion was shattered, she wasn't sure what she believed in anymore. She poured herself a drink, sat across from him, and finally broke the silence. "What do you want me to do?" Alexander looked up slowly. "What do you mean? Do you want me to stay?" she asked, her voice calm but direct. "Because if you do, I need to know that I'm not just standing beside a man who's already halfway out the door." He didn't answer. He stared at her for a long moment, but the words didn't come. He realized then that he wasn't sure if he wanted her to stay. Not because he didn't value her, but because the foundation that had once made their relationship feel powerful now felt hollow. They had built something, yes, but on what? On image, on convenience, on mutual benefit disguised as connection. She didn't wait for a response. She stood, placed her glass down, and walked toward the bedroom. The door closed behind her with a quiet click. Not a slam, just a quiet, final sound. The next morning, Alexander arrived at his office to find a sealed envelope waiting on his desk. It had been delivered by hand. No courier, no tracking, just his name written in familiar cursive. His assistant, confused, said only that a woman had dropped it off, wearing sunglasses and a scarf, saying it was personal. He opened it slowly. Inside was another letter, shorter this time. "I don't want what's yours, Alexander. I only want what's mine. What was always mine. You once taught me that control is perception, but what you forgot is that perception can shift. And now, so has the power. This is not revenge. This is equilibrium." There was no signature, but he didn't need one. He sat for a long time afterward, staring at the window, watching the traffic crawl past. It occurred to him then how fragile everything truly was. Not just his business, but his legacy. All his life, he had measured his success in numbers, in accolades, in square footage. But none of that could shield him from truth, from accountability, from the quiet, steady hands of someone he had dismissed for far too long. And then, without knowing why, he rose from his chair, walked to the corner of the office, and picked up the framed photograph he kept hidden behind a row of books. It was old, faded slightly around the edges. It was a picture of him and Eleanor, taken during one of their earliest business conferences. They were young then, full of ideas, standing side by side not as husband and wife, but as partners. Real partners. He stared at the photo for a long time, then placed it face down on the shelf. That afternoon, he canceled 2 meetings, then a third. He sat alone in his office until the sky turned orange and the city lights began to flicker on. And finally, just before sunset, he picked up the phone and dialed Eleanor's number. Not because he wanted reconciliation, not because he wanted forgiveness, but because he needed to hear her voice. The line rang once, twice, then voicemail. He didn't leave a message. He hung up and sat in silence again. Because even that, he realized, she now had the power to deny. The air was crisp and carried the scent of rain from the night before, the kind of scent that made the city feel cleaner than it really was. The morning sun filtered through the studio windows in soft beams, casting gentle light across Eleanor's desk where a dozen files lay open, her pen resting between notes, and a warm cup of coffee sat beside a vase of fresh tulips. The space, once an empty shell filled only with dreams and uncertain hope, now pulsed with quiet activity. Staff moved in and out of meeting rooms, clients waited in the small lounge area, and the faint sound of laughter echoed down the hallway from a workshop in session. Eleanor stood in front of the wide glass wall that separated her office from the rest of the space, watching it all unfold like a carefully orchestrated symphony. She wasn't just the woman who had started something. She had become its anchor, and she didn't need anyone to tell her that anymore. It had been months since the wedding, months since the letter, months since the carefully curated world Alexander Hartley had built began to slowly fracture under its own weight. News of his financial troubles had begun leaking to the press, first as whispers in industry blogs, then as speculative pieces in business columns. His empire hadn't collapsed entirely, but it no longer held the same intimidating gleam. There were lawsuits in progress now, questions about past deals. A board member had resigned quietly. A few others had distanced themselves. The shareholders were nervous. Olivia had vanished from public view not long after the ceremony. No official statement was made, but people talked. Some said she had taken a settlement and disappeared to Europe. Others believed she had simply walked away, disappointed and disillusioned. Either way, she was no longer at Alexander's side. Eleanor hadn't followed every detail. She didn't need to. She knew enough. What mattered wasn't that he was suffering. It was that he had finally been forced to face the truth, that the life he built was never truly unshakable, and that real power isn't in appearances but in integrity, patience, and quiet perseverance. She didn't rejoice in his fall. There was no satisfaction in watching someone unravel, not even someone who had once discarded her as if she were a chapter better left behind. But there was peace. Not revenge. Not triumph. Peace. She turned from the glass and walked back to her desk, where a folder sat with the final proposal for a new initiative, a partnership with a national organization aimed at mentoring women in transitional phases of life. Divorcees, widows, women returning to the workforce after raising children. The program would be funded in part by a grant Eleanor had secured after months of negotiation. The grant had been awarded not because of her name, but because of her impact. The proposal included plans for satellite locations in 3 cities, a digital platform, and a publishing deal for a book compiling the stories of the women she had helped. She reviewed the document, added her signature, and passed it to her assistant with a satisfied nod. Later that day, Ryan stopped by after his afternoon class. He was taller now, more confident in his movements, his voice deeper. He had started working part-time at the studio, helping with tech support and social media strategies. He carried a quiet maturity that made Eleanor proud in ways she didn't always have words for. He placed a takeaway coffee on her desk and slouched into the armchair across from her. "You look tired," he said with a grin. She laughed softly. "That's because I am. But you also look content." She nodded. "I am that too." He paused for a moment, then asked, "Did you ever think all of this would happen?" "Not like this," she said honestly. "But I always hoped for something close." He looked around the office. "You built something real, Mom." "I tried to," she said. "And I did it differently this time. I didn't build it around someone else. I built it around what I believe in." He gave a small nod, then stood and stretched. "I have to finish that workshop presentation. You want me to close up later?" "Please," she said, smiling. "And maybe check the projector cables again." "Always," he replied, heading toward the door. As he left, Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting toward the photo on her shelf. A picture taken during the first event held in the studio, when the space was still raw, and hope was still something she held cautiously. Now, it wasn't hope. It was conviction. That evening, as she walked out of the building and onto the sidewalk, the city was alive around her. Street musicians played soft tunes near the cafe across the street. People laughed over wine at sidewalk tables, and the faint aroma of roasted garlic drifted from the Italian bistro on the corner. It wasn't the life she had once imagined for herself when she married Alexander Hartley, but it was a life she had built on her own terms. It was quiet, steady, full of meaning, and she wouldn't trade it for any mansion, any diamond, any boardroom filled with hollow accolades. She walked slowly toward the corner, her steps unhurried, her posture relaxed. As she passed the newsstand, she caught sight of a headline on a business magazine, Alexander Hartley's face on the cover, this time accompanied by the words, "The Reckoning of a Titan." She paused for a moment, stared at the headline, then turned away without taking a second look. At home, she opened the door to her modest but elegant apartment, the warmth of the space greeting her like an old friend. She kicked off her shoes, poured herself a glass of wine, and stepped out onto the small balcony that overlooked the city skyline. The same skyline that once belonged to him now looked different. Not because it had changed, but because she had. She took a deep breath and raised her glass to the horizon, to beginnings that come from endings, to strength rediscovered, to the power of silence, of grace, of resilience, to a new dawn.